It is so good to see so many of you both here in this space, also on Zoom, live streaming, and will be captured so that the information and the truth and the honesty of the period and space that we're in right now is chronicled. So thank you for taking the time out of your schedules today to celebrate this third iteration of the University of Michigan's Juneteenth celebration. I am PCB, Dr. Patricia Coleman Burns, and it is my pleasure to work with the convener of this event. She will never take credit for it, Rachel Dawson. And so give her. Because as you well know, often what people say is, I'd never heard of Juneteenth. What are you all talking about? And now with the unions and the HR, so we're gonna add another day for the people who do the work? Yeah, why don't we? And so it is an honor to be here in this space with our keynote, with our main speaker, to talk about voter suppression. The honor is not to be able to talk about voter suppression, but to be with Dr. Dianis. It is a pleasure to be here with her and all her wisdom and her knowledge. So I'm going to do what I really don't like to do, and that's to read from the materials that were printed. But just to point out a couple of things, because we have it here, and then we don't really know what expertise we're being presented. I'm not going to do it all, but I do want to emphasize, because I'm of the generation of Ella Baker. And Ella Baker called herself the midwife of SNCC, and she ushered in a whole new wave of activism among young people. So look that up. Well, this young lady is the godmother of voter rights. And so we need to understand to be the icon that represents a movement is a great responsibility and a tremendous challenge. And I wanted to emphasize that Dr. Judith Brown Dianis is that godmother of a movement that looks for addressing issues of racism and voting rights, policing and criminal justice, and transforming our society into what it can be. We are not limited by where we are in this space. We can make a difference. But we need to be informed, right? We need to know what is, what has been, and what we are moving, what we can move forward to. So, what's going to happen in the time that we have together was the introduction that I just did. The format will be that I have a number of questions that I'm going to ask Dr. Judith, interspersed with the opportunity for me to reframe if I need to or to prompt further. And there will be audience questions, Q&A at the end. There are cards that you can put your questions on that we will get, and there are people around this space to receive your questions. The folk online, if we see something, if John sees something online, we will make sure that those questions are responded to. All right, are we ready? All right. So Dr. Dianis and I, Rachel brought us together so that we could look at what this part of this celebration for Juneteenth could be. And so we know we can read her in her background, we understand the projects that she's involved in. But I really want to ask a more personal question. And the question involves, how did you get started in this work? I mean, many people see the results, right? And they go, oh, she's the godmother of this movement, but she's a person. And where does her passion come from with the idea of stirring up your passion that when we say it's time to move and to time to do things, that we can gravitate in learning how many of us got started in this work. So you've been doing this work with Advancement Project from at least 1999. Why this work? Why focus on fighting voter suppression and the crisis in America? Why is that important now?
Well, first, thank you so much for having me, for spending the time with me. I'm really excited to be here with you all for your third annual Juneteenth celebration. Also excited because my daughter is transferring here in the fall. So, yes, so she told me, go look for a place for me to live while you're there. So I've been walking around all morning taking pictures of signs, for lease signs, like we're on the late side, but don't worry, we're gonna find you a place. Anyway, so she'll be a junior here in the fall, so very excited about it. We loved the campus when we came to visit. My husband and I were like, maybe we can enroll, like I can go teach at the law school. He's a sports agent. There must be some place for him to teach here. So anyway, so really excited to be here. And I mean, to answer your question, I mean, first, I think there's this larger story about my life, which is that I grew up in a household with a mother who was an educator, started off as a third grade teacher and worked her way up to being a superintendent in New York City. She was an activist, a community activist. She was involved in the NAACP in Jamaica, Queens. And she took me to my first protest when I was 3. And I remember because I remember the chant. And it was over a traffic light. My community could not get government to move, a predominantly Black community. And the mothers organized, and a child had been hit by a car, and the mothers organized and put all the children in the middle of the intersection. And I just remember saying, we want a light, we want, and that was like it for me. And then my father was in the segregated army. And so race, he bore the scars of that. So race was always a conversation in our household. And so I went to Penn undergrad, and I was a student organizer there against racism. Then was actually in corporate America for 2 years, where I'm a survivor of race discrimination on the job. That sent me back to law school to be a civil rights lawyer. Went to Columbia Law School, where I was a student activist there and took over the dean's office, shut it down for a couple of days. And so, like, this activism, like, even if I went into corporate America for a minute, I do believe that my purpose is to be here to do the work that I do, that God put me here for that work. And so it is an honor to be doing it. And in terms of voting in particular, I also was a kid who my mom used to take me into the voting booth. From a very early age, I remember the sound of that. Used to be, young people don't know this, used to have a curtain, and you close the curtain, and I remember that sound. And I remember my mom moving the levers to vote. And so it was always an important thing for my family to have a voice in our democracy. And so I was at the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund when I first came out of law school, did a voting case there in Maryland. And then when we started Advancement Project, opened Advancement Project's doors in 1999. We are what we call movement lawyers. We believe that we have to build power in order to end structural racism. And so we work with grassroots organizations. We started in 99, and the 2000 election happened in November of 2000. And so we were the people answering, two people, we only had 3 people on staff. 2 people were answering the phones for the NAACP at their headquarters, and all the calls were coming in from Florida. And we just really couldn't understand what was happening. And so there was No president called on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. By Thursday, the founder of the organization said to me, hey, let's go to Florida. I was like, well, what are we gonna do? She was like, we're voting rights lawyers, we'll figure it out. We got on a plane, went to Florida, worked with the NAACP and others, and ended up filing the lawsuit NAACP versus Katherine Harris, who was the Secretary of State. And that case was important because the Democratic Party had decided that race was not going to be the issue for them. Al Gore didn't want to talk about race. So no one was talking about what happened to Black voters in the state of Florida. And we had done this investigation that showed that Katherine Harris had engaged in purging people off the rolls who shouldn't have been purged, that they had done, I mean, they had done a number of tactics to get people off the rolls. And so we brought that case. And ever since then, Advancement Project has been in the work of protecting voters, to ensure that voters of color have their rights enforced.
There were a couple things that you said that I want to focus on. One is a history of activism in the lives of Black and brown people, that often, up until present day, we didn't share with the larger society. We learned history, in many cases, at the dinner table. Or in my case, when I was 16 in 1963, you can do the math, I marched in Detroit when Martin Luther King came to deliver his first iteration of the I Have a Dream speech. And that was my father, even though I was a teenager, my father took us. And I want to probe this idea because the other day I was in a space and a European identified person, or maybe she identifies as white, talked about being my contemporary and how she was a radical in that period, but how, unlike some of us that till today are on the same journey, gave it up. Why do you think these different generations that may be into this work end up, unless they are the oppressed or why do you think that happens, that we aren't able to sustain the struggle across broad breadths of people? I'm going somewhere with that, but just tell.
I feel like this is the setup. You said, I'm going someplace with this. I'm like, okay. So, well, first, I mean, I think that that people get comfortable, right? If this isn't your life, if this isn't the battle and the struggle of your people, right? You can be in the work for a minute and not because, and because you think it's important, right? But then you get to a place where you're comfortable and you don't have to think about it, right? For some of us, we got to think about it all the time, right? Like to be a student, for example, at a predominantly white institution and to not have the freedom to just be on campus and just be, the freedom of not having to think about that what that professor said that was racist or what happened to a student that was accosted by the police. Like, I don't know what that feels like, right? I don't know what it feels like to just be throwing a Frisbee around, chasing my dog, like just having fun and not having the weight of what it means to live in a society that, is racist on many levels. So if you don't have to deal with it, I mean, why would you? Like most of us would say, hey, well, why would I opt into that, right? If I didn't have to. And I think, there's also even for Black folks, right? There comes a time when parents actually don't want their children to carry that burden, right? and who say, you know what, I want my child to actually live that free life as for as long as they can until they get woken up, unfortunately, right? And so they get protected from this, right? Like I remember actually my daughter has said to me, coming here will be a full circle moment because when she was 9 months old, I bundled her up and we stood in front of the Supreme Court in the Michigan affirmative action case. She was 9 months old, and people were like, you got your baby out here? And and I remember the student group that was called By Any Means Necessary. And we were out there. And here it is. She's like, I'm going to Michigan. Imagine that. I was like, yeah, and imagine they only got 4% black students. So that case meant something, right? But I think, this issue of like, there are times when people want to throw down. 2020 was one of them, right? Where we see that it wasn't just black people on the streets, that Americans came together and said enough, right? But then many people have been able to move on while others of us still have to fight the fight.
I wanted you to hit it when we were in that space, because often the format is we identify the problem, we come up with ideas and examples, and then at the very end, when everybody's asleep, then we talk about action. So we got one right here. The first thing is don't give up. Don't let it be comfortable and easy to choose a road where you don't have to continue to struggle if it's not part of who your identity is. First lesson, walk away with don't give up. Because whether you believe it or not, what affects all of us, brown and black people, affect you too. Which brings me to the second question. So, the theme of, because of the systemic nature of what we're talking about here, the theme of our symposium is systems check. So, we're checking all the systems that so many of us buy into and exploring structural solutions to systemic racism. And we know that voting is one of those most fundamental rights and important systems in our democracy, and that voter suppression has always disproportionately affected black people. Can you help us understand how systemic racism manifests itself in the current system of voting, surrounding voting and elections here in the United States? We're in this space right now. What does love have to do with it? What does systemic racism have to do with voter suppression?
So I'm going to try not to be too lawyerly, and just break down kind of a little bit of the trajectory of where we've been with regard to voting rights, right? We start off with a country that is based on colonialism, that has anti-blackness built into the very foundation, where black people can't vote. Get the 15th Amendment to the Constitution. I'm run through this real quick, right? 1870, can't deny black men, right, voting. And then we have a period, right, during Reconstruction where black people, have estimated about 2,000 black people have been elected to Congress, state, and local. And then, this is the back and forth of our democracy. Oh, wait a second. They're getting elected? They're getting elected? Well, first of all, we got to put in place these laws that disenfranchise people for felonies. And we're going to change the criminal laws to make those laws really target black people. So we get felony disenfranchisement. Then we get all of the Jim Crow tools. We get poll taxes, literacy tests. We get grandfather clauses. We get extreme violence, right, to prevent people from access to the ballot. And so people, like still trying to vote. Some people die, some people there's bloodshed. And then we get the Voting Rights Act, right? And it's not all that easy, right? I'm kind of simplifying, but a lot of lives lost, a lot of protest, a lot of people taking risks that no American should have to take in order to participate in our democracy. Voting Rights Act of 1965. And then we see, Black people start getting elected, right? Latino folks start getting elected as a result of that. So I'm gonna fast forward to, there's a Black man that runs for president. He was not supposed to win, right? And so 2008, Barack Obama wins an election. Immediately after that, we start to see we have to understand that white supremacy and the tools of white supremacy adapt. You can get wins and victories, and then the system morphs to give you the same outcomes. So we had literacy tests, we had poll taxes, now we've got voter ID laws. These voter ID laws were very restrictive voter ID. So you have to have a current ID with your signature on it, with your current address, with the photo on it, knowing that there are, first of all, a lot of elderly Black people, not born in a hospital, right, who don't have an ID, don't have a birth certificate. You've got young people who don't engage with the government, who don't have an ID. And so you see those laws starting to pass in about 2011. You also start to see cutbacks in early voting, because what happened was the people who are the anti-democracy people, they started looking at how'd they vote? Wait a second, they used that early voting thing? Oh, they voted on Sunday? They had caravans of churches doing souls, they called it souls to the polls. Oh, we got to cut out that Sunday voting, because that's God wouldn't want us to do that, right? So, cut back early voting, cut back Sunday voting. So they started to put in place all these new changes to make it harder for people to vote. In 2008, yes, so 2008, actually 2008, Advancement Project actually brought a lawsuit, because one of the things that we knew was that Black folks were going to turn out for Barack Obama, right? And what we also knew, and I knew this from my personal experience. I used to go to work on election day and say to people, to the white folks, how long did it take you to vote? How long did it take you? 10 minutes, 15 minutes. Might take me an hour and a half, right? So we knew 2008, Black people were going to turn on record numbers. So we did this study in several different states to see if there were going to be disparities and to project out what those disparities could do. Because if people are waiting in line for a long time, they're going to leave. If I have to pick up my kid from daycare, they're going to charge me $1 a minute. I need to pick up my kid. I'm not going to stay in line. If I have to go to work, I'm not going to stay in line. And so what we found was there were disparities in the allocation of voting machines, and that there were disparities in the allocation of poll workers. Because the more poll workers you have, then the easier it is to move through the line. And so we ended up suing the state of Virginia and a few of the counties in order to make sure that they reallocated the machines. And literally, like the day before the election, they came into court and they were like, oh, we fixed the problem. And so they had reallocated, so we didn't see those long lines. But Georgia, right, years later, we see those same kinds of things popping up. So anyway, so we see these kinds of new structural barriers that make it harder for people to vote popping up after Barack Obama is elected. So 2012, we start seeing them again. And then enter the Supreme Court. Supreme Court decides a case that's referred to as Shelby County, a case out of Alabama, that did away with a really important part of the Voting Rights Act, which was Section 5. Section 5 required that states, mostly in the South, who had a history of discrimination, had to get any changes to voting pre-approved by the Department of Justice or by a court. So the Supreme Court does away with the formula that covers Section 5. So now it's all bets off. The floodgates are open. The vote suppressors are like, we are free to do whatever we want to do. The day that that case came out, the governor of Texas tweeted, Now we can put in place our voter ID law, which was a very restrictive law. North Carolina, they passed their law, which was called the Monster Voter Suppression Law. Vansa Project brought a lawsuit on behalf of the NAACP of North Carolina. It was the kitchen sink of voter suppression. We won that case, and we won a voter ID case in North Carolina, but this has been the continuation, right? Georgia, right? We have a lawsuit in Georgia. Georgia, that happens because 2020, you know, but Georgia. Georgia was not supposed to be blue. But the problem was that people hadn't realized Black people are moving to Georgia in droves, in droves. And there have been a lot of groups organizing and registering, not just Stacey Abrams, there are a lot of other groups, that Stacey Plus, right, who were doing the work of registering people. And so you had these increase in registration and Black people turning out, maybe for Joe Biden, but definitely for Warnock, who's running. And then you have Trump running around looking for 8,000 some odd votes in the state of Georgia so that he can win. So Georgia happens, and we see what happens. They're like, oh, wait a second, they turned out, they passed a new law. We can't give water and food to people in line. And who's that targeting? Black voters, because they know we have to wait in line longer, right? And so that's what I'm saying is, like, we see these wins, we see Black people turning out in record numbers, winning some things, and then the system readjusts. These legislatures pass bad laws. The courts enter into the picture. We got rid of Section 5. The Supreme Court then does another case out of Arizona where they weaken the Voting Rights Act, another section of the Voting Rights Act. So now we're left with less protection for voters. And it means that organizations like mine have to do more work in terms of suing. We can't just rely on the Department of Justice, but we have to be suing all of these states all the time. And so we have to understand that part of this is driven by not just Barack Obama, but the changing demographics of America. And what is happening is that we are seeing the browning of America, both Black and brown people, and the rising numbers, right? And a rising majority. And that white supremacy is holding on. Some people call it the third Reconstruction, right? Because they're holding on to their power, whether it's through phrases like "Take Back America" or "Make America Great Again." And many of us are wondering, was it ever great? And so this is the kind of power grab that is happening across the country to really neutralize and neuter the power that we have been building for so long. I'm sorry, that was a really long answer. I had to get through like hundreds of years of history in a little period of time.
And this protection piece, remind me to ask about that in a minute, but I want to go back to the first thing that you said around 1865 and the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. I want to say that because we must pay attention, we must stay awake. Juneteenth, this is one of my pet peeves, you will hear people say that Juneteenth represents when all the enslaved Africans were set free. It does not. And why is that important is because the way in which the powers that be will counter everything that we do. And so what, in fact, the Emancipation Proclamation signed as an executive order by President Lincoln did was to free the enslaved Africans in the states that had seceded from the Union. And therefore, the Africans in the states that were loyal, were part of the Union, remained in slavery. Why is that important? Because sometimes if we don't know the truth, if we don't know our history, then people can just pull the wool over our eyes. And we have to be always up on what is going on. I know it's tiring, and I know often we get tired. So it wasn't until the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were passed at the end of 1865, which was 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, and in the year that the notice had gotten to Galveston, Texas. You all following this? That in fact it was ratified by the legislator. Why is that important? Because we must look at all the efforts of those who would counter our rights as human beings to be self determined and to vote in our own best interests. And so the other piece is we have to watch who we vote for. That's part of that protection piece. When you vote for folk who are going to protect rights, then you have the freedom to express your rights. But we have to know what people's histories are and what their, so it's not just the voter suppression, but it is who are the people who put those laws into place and whether or not we need them. Now, one of the solutions is going to be all of you all in here, especially young folk who have in, or older folk, you need to run for these places, these Secretary of States, clerks, run for these offices so that we can make sure the protection is there. And so,
We
why?
didn't really talk about the what changes we need to have, right? So, because I think, I mean, to your point, so we have voter suppression, we're dealing with it, it is hard, the courts are horrible right now. Although there was a good case that just came out recently, and we were all like shocked at the voting rights case that just came out. But I think so, because I wanted to add like the who we're voting for. The redistricting question is also critically important because that locks in power, right? And so we have places where, and this Alabama case was really important that just came out, because the way that redistricting is happening is that that Black and Brown communities are being packed into particular districts together to limit the amount of political power. And redistricting really does keep power in place for not just 10 years, but really 20 years. And so voting is important, but like the inability to vote for people of our choice still happens because of the redistricting process. So I did want to it's not all gloom and doom. It's mostly cloudy day. Um, it's funny that it is a mostly cloudy day, with some thunderstorms and all of that. And so, like Michigan, you all have been like leading the way more recently in the kinds of change that we need to see. Prop 2 that passed is really important, critically important. And this is one of the things that we need to be doing is like when you take these issues to the people, right, instead of the legislatures where people are voted in and they're trying to save their own butts and their own jobs, right, and their own power. But when you give it to the people are like, well, why wouldn't we do these common sense things to make it easier to vote, right? Why wouldn't we have early voting? Why wouldn't we have absentee voting? Why, all of those things, why do we need that crazy voter ID that some states want to have? And so Prop 2 is really important, and to make it part of the Constitution is critically important so that it becomes harder to make those changes later. Now, what's happening in many states when they take these questions to the people and the people vote yes, some states are now getting rid of the ballot initiative process. They're like, oh, wait a second, we can't let the voters actually make decisions on their own. So we have a whole movement in this country to actually get rid of propositions and ballot initiatives so that the state legislatures can have all of the power. There's also one of the things that's happened in Virginia. Virginia, right, was the capital of the Confederacy. They were able to pass a state voting rights act a few years ago. I had the honor of being there to watch the then governor, sign the Voting Rights Act into place. It's modeled after the Federal Voting Rights Act, and we need more states to pass those voting rights acts, because if we can't rely on the federal law, because the Supreme Court is like dismantling voting rights brick by brick, at least we can do where we can get state laws passed, we have to get that done, whether through ballot initiative or legislative process. On felony disenfranchisement, we had a huge win in Florida. We're one of, as an organization, one of the founding members of the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition that was able to pass a ballot initiative to get rid of that barrier to voting in the state. And then the state legislature came back and was like, oh, wait a second, not so fast. All these people have to pay their fines and their fees and restitution before they can vote. And so it was a huge win, and then it was taken away. And so there are some things happening out there. Automatic voter registration is happening in a lot of states, right? Like, why, that's the other thing, is our election system is antiquated, right? We have these things called computers now, and the internet, right? And the World Wide Web, right? That can make things easier, but the election system hasn't been invested in, just like our infrastructure, our roads and bridges haven't been invested in. The roads and bridges and foundations of our democracy have not been invested in a real way that would make it easier for us to participate.
Somewhere I want to know, why don't people want the people to vote? But hold on to that. Let's do a quick audience check. In the state of Michigan, if you are a formerly incarcerated person, can you vote? Raise your hand if you believe you can vote if you are a formerly, how many say, no, you can't do that? All right. How many don't know? Find out. You can. We have voted in a Secretary of State who has promoted the ability. You use the language, I don't know but if you've been formerly incarcerated, you can vote in the state of Michigan. Know what the people you voted for are doing and are not doing, and make sure you show up and tell everybody you can vote here in the state of Michigan. One more test, because question, I'm a professor, how we do, got to test you.
Isn't school over though? School's out of session, isn't it?
Oh, no.
No.
Summer school. The grandson gave me a video, picture yesterday. Grandmommy, my last day he's a rising 5th grader. Oh, he's so proud. He's out, but no, you're not. Is there early voting in the state of Michigan? How many say yes? Raise your hand. How many say no? I don't mean absentee voting. Are there early voting days in the state of Michigan? How many say yes? How many say no? How many don't know? We have a new policy. I don't know what they're called.
9 days. You have 9
We have
days.
7.
No,
She told me 7. Is it 9?
It's 9. At least under the proposition, it's 9. But but this is like one of those things, like early voting makes sense, right? Why should we all have to go on election day? That's so antiquated, right? This is like, we're not in harvest days any longer, where we have to work, people work. And so now with early voting, it does make it easier. And this is one of the things that happened during the pandemic, was that we were able to get some really good concessions from states and election officials, because what we kept saying is, like, people should not have to put their health in danger in order to cast a ballot. And so that's how we got drop boxes. We didn't have drop boxes before, right? Drop boxes came because of that. Absentee voting became more popular because of that. Early voting became more popular because of that. But then what happened was, states like Georgia were like, well, wait a second, they actually used that. We need to get rid of that. The state of Texas, right? They had, in Houston, they actually had 24-hour voting. They had a whole concert where people could come at midnight, 2 a.m., come vote. And what did they want to do? The Texas legislature has now they are getting rid of the Harris County elections official. That's the only county they're getting rid of it. And they're like, someone else is gonna run elections, not that great. Drop boxes, you all now have drop boxes written into that proposition, which is incredible. And it's a formula by the number of voters, but it means like a place like Detroit's gonna have like 30 drop boxes across the city. And that's incredible because people work, right? And just because I work doesn't mean I don't want to vote. And so this really, I mean, this question of why, right, is just an ongoing question about who do we want to be when we grow up as America, right? Do we want an inclusive society where all people get to have a say in the laws that will rule their lives, right? Or do we want to have a country that is made for some, ruled by some, right? We started off with a country that only white land-owning men could vote, right? There was a time when Native Americans were told they were not citizens and they could not vote, right? And so where are we going with this, right? And it is a question of why does it have to be an us versus them, a power grab, as opposed to why can't we all participate in this experiment that is called democracy?
That also, the why question is a question that comes up that we saw at Reconstruction, that we saw at the election of Obama. The idea that some people should not have the right to make decisions for majority people. But perhaps what really should happen is we should engage in conversations and discussions with each other to figure out why a certain group of people consistently vote for more rights to the ballot than others. What are you trying to preserve? And having that discussion, lest we have an apartheid type situation here in the United States. We cannot have that. So, let me look at the time. We're good. What about, so this next question deals with either the distrust. Why, as we do these things, we give more early voting dates, we give more drop boxes, we do all these things to make sure that more and more people can vote. Then the question becomes, why do we have this like 70-30 formula, but 30% of the people are the ones that vote? I don't know what the numbers are, but they're really very embarrassing when you think about how many people actually come out to vote. And so the question says, we have to repair the issue around it doesn't matter if I vote. How many of you have heard people say, why, it doesn't matter, they're all the same? And so we have to look at educating our people, knowing the history. What Fannie Lou Hamer, see, folk misquote and give different information. So right now, you will hear, for example, the Republican Party say, well, we're the party of Lincoln. Right? And the Democrats have been the most oppressive. So if you know the story of Fannie Lou Hamer, that was true. The Dixiecrats would not allow the black delegation to be seated in the Democratic convention. So we know we have this checkered history all over. And so why is voting so important for people in this period? And how should we be teaching and talking to younger generations, and maybe even some of the older generations, about voting in our country? And how do we explain all the down the line things that voting impacts? What difference does voting make is the question. And what are the best ways to teach about voter suppression? Why does it matter? How do we share that information? How do we teach ourselves, among ourselves, that it does make a difference? and what we should do to overcome these issues.
So first I want to start with congratulating this campus for its turnout rates, because I looked them up. So registration rates in 2020, 88.5% of students. The average for schools was 78%. And the voting rate, 88.2%. And the average for schools is 66%. So this is an engaged community, which is important. Now, the rest of the country, no, I'm just kidding. I think, so first of all, I think for many people, we're in a, they used to call it like the microwave generation. Now it's not. There's something better than microwave generation to explain it at this point. But there's a few things, right? Like people expect, like, I'm going to vote and my life is going to change. And for a lot of people, voting has not led to a change in the material conditions of their lives. And that we may not understand that this is a journey, right? The arc of justice, the journey towards freedom, whatever analogy you want to use, right? That this is a long process to get the change we want. And that there is probably not one candidate who will line up on every issue the same way that you think about things. I have not seen a perfect candidate yet that agrees with me on everything. No way. And so, they go in, they do something that you don't like, and then you're like, I don't want to vote for that person ever again, right? But the other things they got right. So there's this kind of like expectation that is an immediate expectation, immediate gratification. I mean, in a place where, I was in the airport recently where they didn't have like a restaurant, but they have like this wall, and you just press a button and a food pops out, right? Like there's not a person, there's nothing, but there's immediate gratification at this wall. And so we have different expectations about how quickly things can change. I would also say that I would not circle in on young people in particular, because one thing that we've been finding is that Gen Z, they're turning out. First of all, Gen Z is like the protest generation. I love me some Gen Z, even despite my kid being a Gen Zer. I love, because, this is a generation that probably maybe their first protest was when Trayvon was murdered and they were little, right? Maybe their first like on the street stuff was when George Floyd and Breonna Taylor were murdered. And they're like the dreamers, right? For Latino, like a lot of Latino students who have been protesting to make sure that they can stay in this country, that they can get DACA. They're the generation that's dealing with the repeal of Roe v. Wade, like how did that happen, right? And so they're doing their work, right? And their numbers, like we've done polling in the past 3 election cycles of young voters of color, and what we wanted to see was, is there alignment across communities of color? So Asian, Black, Latinx, Indigenous folks. Alignment on issues, right? And we found that there was. Like the things that they wanted to turn out for was they were, discrimination, hate crimes, and policing issues across the board. That was something that was a motivator for them to participate in voting. And so I think that they're good, and they're running for office. They're running for office. You got this young guy out of Florida, Frost, who's like, who's on fire. AOC ain't that old either, right? Cori Bush is not that old. So you have this generation of young people who are moving into that space. Now, if you look back generations like the SNCC folks who were young, who were college students, there were a few of them that went into government, right? Or were elected officials eventually. You might have had one Black Panther who actually became an elected official. But like for the most part, those folks were still dealing with like structural changes that wouldn't allow for them to be. But I think this generation sees it very differently and taps their power. Now, I do think that one of the things that we have to make sure that people understand is, and part of what we did in past election cycles was to talk to young people and others about down ballot races, right? With the idea that, we didn't know whether or not people were going to turn out for Joe Biden. And in the next election, I'm really not sure, right? Because young people, I know my daughter's like, he's a little old, She's like, I don't know, right? Like, should I really be voting for him? Now she's gonna vote, and she's gonna be here, and she's gonna be part of that 88%, right? But how do we make sure that everyone understands that it's not just about president, right? It's about the mayor who appoints the police chief, right? If you're young people, you care about policing, you care about the mayor who appoints the police chief. You care about the sheriff who's locking up immigrants, right? You care about the school board, right? Where they're banning books on Rosa Parks, right? Like at least we thought there was at least one Black person that would never get like, excommunicated in this country, and it was Rosa Parks. Now you could kick out Martin, but Rosa, banning a book on Rosa Parks? Even if you thought like because most kids think like the history is she sat down because she was tired and she got arrested, right? They don't know the real Rosa Parks, but like even that Rosa's getting banned. So, I think like for us to explain and connect the dots for folks, right, about its healthcare, its student debt, right? Like who's against the student debt stuff? Let's be real, right? Who's taking it to court, right? And we need to understand that some of these cases that come up through the Supreme Court, this is very intentional. These cases don't, like these voting rights cases don't just wind up in the Supreme Court. The affirmative action cases don't just wind up in the Supreme Court. The right wing has been testing cases, finding the perfect plaintiffs. Oh, let's get some Asian folks on board because they'll be down with us because they have record numbers at these universities and they're gonna feel like they're being discriminated against. So let's use them, right? And so all of these things are very intentional, right? And so we've gotta be able to make the connections. If I think about like even the courts, like Joe Biden gets an A+ on his judicial appointments. Just put another person, an young Asian brother who's a civil rights lawyer, a voting rights lawyer, just got confirmed like 2 days ago. Dale Ho is one of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund lawyers, incredible lawyer. And like, but if the Senate was not controlled by the Democrats, Dale would have not even been nominated, right? And so making all of those connections, how it is all connected, right? Into the kind of like decisions and the kind of world and kind of country that we want to build is most important right now because everything, like everything big is at stake.
If there are any who have questions, begin to send them over. This whole notion, I really liked how you celebrated the young people and what they're doing here on campus, because often the narrative is, and I'm a faith woman, that we look like grasshoppers in our own eyes, that we look like less than. And knowing that we're more powerful than we can even imagine. And part of the voter suppression is because we are so powerful. But if you can convince us that we have no power, that we are less than, that we're not going to succeed, then that's pretty depressing when you think about it. When you begin to feel, well, what the heck? Can't win. But when you get the data, when you get the evidence, and you begin to know and feel your power, there's nothing that can stop us, which is why so
Yeah.
much suppression. Go ahead.
And that's not to say that everybody's we still have gaps, right? Turnout gaps in race, right? Like, and within gender, right? Like Black men in 2020, only 44% turnout. Black women, 53% turnout. And so again, it gets to this question of, do you think you have the power to make change? And if you don't, then why would you sit it out? I think the other thing that I wanted to add to this is that we're also in a period of time where misinformation and disinformation is undermining democracy, right? The vote deniers who are peddling disinformation in order for us to question the outcome of elections, and not just question them, but like, have an insurrection, right? Like I like never thought that we would have an insurrection in this country. I was like, I watched what was that show with Kerry Washington, and yes, and so I always thought there was a real daddy pope, right? There's another government under the government that's gonna protect us from the insurrectionists. And I was like watching live. I live in the D.C. area. I'm like, where is Daddy Pope right about now? Because this shouldn't be happening, right? And so, but it wasn't just January 6th. Vote deniers ran for office in order to be the ones to administer elections. They ran for Secretary of State. So you don't believe in the system, but you want to run it, right? And so that is a very scary thing, where literally there are people who want to undermine the actual system. And it really is like, I think about like, when my daughter was young and we would play Uno, and you're getting down to that last card, and you got one card, you say Uno, right? And then the kids all say, but wait a second, no, you were supposed to do this. Like they're changing the rules because they know I'm getting ready to win. Like I'm getting ready to put it down. They're like, you didn't say it fast enough. I'm like, I didn't put it down on the table yet. So why would I have said? But like that's the game that we're up against, right? Which is like Uno. It's like we're gonna, oh, wait a second, you won? We're gonna change the rules. And so that's like that's why we have to be vigilant. Let's get back to the first question about being comfortable. You should never be comfortable. You might be in Michigan and you pass this nice proposition. Ooh, good for you. Don't get comfortable, because there are people who are upset about what you did. And there are people who will never give up on the idea that they are going to take back their America.
And then, even in this environment, I put a note, watch what they do, not what they say. And in the midst of us doing so well, wherever we may be, remember all the principles of humanity. I don't care what your dress looks like, or your hair, or who you go home to. But notice how people are going after these frivolous things and making us lock her up. Oh, she did that. You don't know those people. Doing the hard work to look at concrete principles of measurement. How do you know whether someone is doing a good job? Not what somebody said on the news last night, not these rumors that we pass around where we tear people down, but looking at what folk do and looking at our own selves. We're human. And so, how do we make a decision around the deep systemic ways in which those in power pit us against each other? Pit us against each other. Bring up issues that have nothing to do with anything. Say they're being moral, and actually it's just about getting back in control. And I really do, and then we need to be moving to questions and answers, but I really do like this issue of protractedness. Protractedness. If we are 100 years into a civil rights movement and still dealing with those issues, or 200 years, that should tell us that things take time. They're not going to happen in a microwave. And giving our people the sense of how things are sustainable and protracted, and so that we can see the long road. Are you planning? Where should we be in 10 years? Where should we be when your daughter graduates in 2 years? Where should we be? Where should we be in 10 years? Where should we be as a country? Each of you, where do you want to be in 15 years, in 20? What kind of world do we want to live in? And then how do we get there? Thought.
Okay, oh, that's too big a question.
Oh my goodness. Okay, so we need these. How many remember your civics lesson in this last election where you had, remember we saw the people knocking on the Michigan's Capitol building, talking about they were there to be the electoral college people. And you would tell folk, well, here's the process. In November, you have to go and actually verify the vote, and then in January of whatever that date is, and we learned a lot about civics that we had forgotten about since we were in middle school or high school. Please speak to the Electoral College and the composition of the Senate, 2 states, 2 for each state, and how they contribute to canceling the one-person vote.
I think the person who wrote that should speak to it because they already know. Somebody like knows. So there's been talk for a long time about getting rid of the Electoral College because it is inequitable that every state, regardless of the size of population, so Montana, Wyoming, not calling them out, they're nice states, I guess, that they get the same representation in the Senate. And so there have been efforts to let's do away with this because there's also a history that's tied to slavery. And so, but we tend to hold on to these vestiges of slavery for a long time. And the Electoral College is one of them. I just don't, I don't think it's gonna happen anytime soon that we're gonna get rid of it. I mean, it would take a lot to undo it. Advancement Project, for example, we have been advocating for an actual constitutional amendment for a right to vote. Most people do not know that you actually do not have a right to vote in this country. That you, in the Constitution or the amendments, it says you can't be denied voting because of race, but you don't have a right to vote. And so what we've been talking about is that if we had a right to vote, it would mean that, first of all, we could establish national standards of how we vote. Because why should the people in Georgia not have the 9 days of early voting when they go to vote for president, and you all do, right? Like, why don't we have some national standards? Why do some states get to have absentee ballots and others don't when we're all voting for president? So we would have national standards, and the other thing it would do, and this is the legal part, so I'm gonna be a little lawyer for a minute, is that it would change the standard for courts' review of election cases. Right now, you have a stronger right to carry a gun and First Amendment rights than you do voting rights, because the courts do not look at them the same way. They have what we call strict scrutiny. A law comes before them about your right to carry a gun, and the court has to say, well, we're gonna look at this with strict scrutiny because they're trying to do away with this law. A voting law comes along and it's like, oh, it's rational for the state to say that. And so it would heighten the way that the courts would look at this. And so we've been pushing for that. And I will tell you that most people are like, you all are crazy. We're never going to get a right to vote in this country. It would take too much. It would take the states ratifying it, and then you'd have to Congress. And so it's a very long journey. Now, some of what we're doing when we say we want a right to vote is also just educating people, right? That you actually don't have a right to vote in this country, and that's why this is all screwed up. And and also we have to be thinking about, and this is to your point about the protractedness, what do we want to be? Right? What do we want to imagine? You know, like I'm a person that imagines a world with no police. Crazy. But like it's something to dream about, right? To think about what would it look like for my community not to be stopped and frisked? What would it look like? You know, what would it look like for kids to get hugs in school instead of cops walking down the hallway that they don't trust? And so, you know, we have to dream about these things because where we started off, right, was not good. And we always have to be in the constant motion of imagining the country that we want to have. So, this electoral college, let's imagine it. What would it look like not to have that? What would it look like to have the Senate kind of actually balanced out in a way that actually is upholding one person, one vote? So, let's keep dreaming about that.
Because the bottom was, I hadn't thought about it that way, that we don't really have the right to vote. We have the right to vote for folk who represent us in certain structures and that they're determined by states. I hadn't really, that's a goal for us. And so in that question, it says canceling one person, one vote. So the future for us might be that what we want is for my vote to count. Also understanding when we're fighting against anti-racism and against anti-blackness, we know the history of many of these states' laws were because of decisions that some people didn't have the right to deny them of a right to enslave Africans. And we need to break all of that.
And that's
Go ahead.
important because part of this, like even this right to vote issue, that was a compromise that was made because of slavery, right? It was like we have an elections clause that doesn't give people the rights to vote, right? And it's about the states having power, right? Because they wanted to ingrain states' rights. And those folks have still been ingraining states' rights. And so, in fact, we have a case that's coming before the Supreme Court that is this wacky theory called the independent state legislature theory, which would basically say that because the elections clause refers to state legislatures, it does not include state courts. So what it would do is that state courts would not be able to interpret the laws of the state. It's only left to the state legislature. And that again is because states' rights was the thing that people were trying to protect, which again dates back to a period of slavery.
And the 3/5 of a person, right? That was, you don't get a one person vote in the first place, but the Africans are going to be considered only 3/5 of a person in determining representation. Know our history. Biden is old, but, well, I'm old.
That is a fact, not, that is an evidence.
But he's getting things done that matter to all of us. Can you speak to this being as important as his age? They just want us to emphasize, because if we go on age, I wouldn't be up here.
He's seasoned. That's what he is. He's seasoned, well seasoned, like Black people potato salad seasoned. So I mean, I don't know what to say to that. Like I'm not here to be his stump person, but a lot has been accomplished, right? And that's what he's gonna be graded on, right? Is like, what did you do for me? Right. And I think that people are going to have to get past the age thing because he's the age that he is. And the guy who just got indicted is actually not, he's no young buck, by the way, right? And so it is about, like, at the end of the day, you elect people to get the business done that you want done. And if he's doing that, doesn't matter how old he is, right? If he continues to do it and he's continuing to have clarity and, et cetera, that's all important, right? And he does have that. I mean, he is moving an agenda that is important, that ticks off lots of things, like even like things like childcare. And I mean, there's a lot of good stuff that's happening in Washington, which, used to be called the swamp, but now it's kind of dried out. And I think some good things are happening. And so that's what he and any other person that runs for that office has to be, that's what the thing is. What have you done for me lately?
And surrounding himself with people who have both the energy and the ability, the physical ability to get things done. We should not be doing any of this work alone. Now, this one I have to just read it because I have no idea what this is about. Because I don't know about this. What about the interstate compact that will agree to award their electoral college votes to the popular vote winner? Isn't a constitutional amendment far more difficult than the above? 17 states that total 205 electoral college votes have enacted this agreement. Do you know about that?
So I think who's the person? Come on. Come on, speak up. You read about it too, yes. Yeah, so can I have the card so I could just like keep referring back to it? Yeah, that's okay. Um, did you learn about this in political science this year? No, just kidding. No, I was talking to this. To the
Yes,
person
stand up, young lady, so we can. No, you stand up, please. Yes, there she is.
Yeah. So thank you for your question. So I mean, just so there is this continuing, like there's the electoral college question, and then there's like why can't we just go by popular vote, get it done with, especially for for president, right? Like, because people just still don't get, like, why does this thing, the electoral college rule, right? It's while we say we have, our democracy is a direct representation republic, it's actually not. It's very indirect, right? You actually elect the elector and the elector elects the president, right? And the problem is that now we have all these places where they're like, oh, we're going to switch out the electors. The deniers are really trying to take over by switching out the electors, and in some places not going along with the way that the popular vote worked out. They can overrule what the people said, right? And I think your state in that proposition actually fixed it in Michigan about the electors. But I think this is one of the things that Congress is trying to work on. And I think I'm hoping that we're going to be able to actually fix this before the next election. But the problem is that state by state, you get the shenanigans of states trying to do their own thing, right? And at the end of the day, that gets back to the states' rights thing. And these are the things that are hard to explain to people about why you have to vote, right? Like even explaining the electoral college in and of itself. But I think to your point, like there is a question about, shouldn't we just go with the popular vote? Why, like, you can't explain to people why we're not doing that. And why does this person who gets elected to be my elector actually get to make a decision for me when I'm the person who voted? And so there are some things that are antiquated. They're antiquated, but they are related to the power grabs that have always existed in this country, right? That maintains the power of some against the many. And that's the thing that I think that we have to change as structural changes in order to get the kind of society where we can actually all participate.
Thank you. Thank you. We have 1 minute. And so I like to end any moderation that I do by asking, what can we do for you?
Me, personally? Well, when my daughter gets here, and I'm just kidding. Can you find me some housing real quick? Cheap housing. Y'all pay a lot of money for housing up here. That's crazy. Anyway, sorry. I mean, I think number one is to just proselytize, right? That's number one. Like, how do we used to have this, there was a campaign in Florida around voting that was called Arrive with Five, right? So it is really, it's like, get your community and get your people, right? When it's time for voting and registration, to make sure that like everybody you know, all your family members are registered, they understand the rules of the road, they understand when they have to show up, and that they go vote. Two is you can always support Advancement Project at advancementproject.org. There's a donate button. And you should feel free because we do need support to continue in this fight. You know, we're fighting for our country and for our people because we know we can do a lot better. We know that this is an inclusive, that we can build an inclusive society. That is the thing that where everyone can thrive and be free, and that's what we're working towards. So that's it.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. Let's give Dr. Judith Brown Dianis a big round of applause. Give yourselves a big round of applause because I could see your minds working. I could see you figuring out what the next steps are. And let's move forward as we continue to celebrate Juneteenth and all the lessons that we're learning, and that we tell somebody else, proselytize, tell somebody what you learned today and what you're going to do next. Thank you so very much.